The Lost Boys is one of the greatest vampire movies ever made. Having elements of a feel-good coming-of-age Spielberg movie, but taking on a much darker tone with its roots embedded in horror. It's an absolute cult classic that sort of revitalized the vampire movie as a whole, managing to make Nosferatu's both cool and scary. Think of it as the anti-Twilight, pumping life into the undead as opposed to driving a stake through the genre's heart. I would argue that for a long time being, most vampire shows and vampire flicks that followed it tried to follow in its footsteps. Even hit shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel, at the very least, took cues from the Lost Boys. The story follows the Emerson family as they move to California, where they discover their new town's dark history of missing people and fanged gang activity. The movie's one of a kind. I just really wish it would have stayed that way. For as great as The Lost Boys was, its sequels are not. They're almost as bad as the first one's good. As a matter of fact, I'd be willing to bet that a decent portion of you watching might not have even known that the movie had any sequels. And if you're in that camp, well, then you're gonna wish you would have stayed in that camp. Because if you did see these movies, then you'd probably already know just how bad they are. If you've watched them in any capacity, a scene, a trailer, then their awfulness goes without saying. And yet, it needs to be stated. These movies were some of the biggest disappointments of my young movie watching life. Have you ever witnessed something that was so bad, but you wanted it to be so good, so you just pretended that it was? You desperately try to convince yourself that something that is blatantly awful is actually awesome, because that's where I was with these films. I wasn't a Star Wars fan growing up, so this was like my own personal prequel problem. Oh, episode 1 has to be good, because 4, 5, and 6 are so great. Yeah, that was me, but for these. These movies were good, they played the song. Just worse. I mean, they were great, as a matter of fact. The 2 Coreys came back for it. Even the other dude that nobody knows his name is in on it. How could these movies possibly be bad? They got the brother of the guy from the first one. But deep down inside, I knew. How could you not know? I knew that I was putting far too much faith in bad faith films. As a testament to the quality of this trilogy, let me just fill you in. The first follow-up was made 2 decades after the success of the first flick. So to say that this sequel was unnecessary would be a complete understatement.
They're making a sequel to Lost Boys. Warner Brothers Home Video is doing some crappy sequel. The point is, whenever they try to do something 20 years later, if they're not doing it right, then it shouldn't be done at all.
The Lost Boys 2 follows the formula of the first one, but only in terms of plot, which is the one thing that they probably should have deviated from. Much like The Lost Boys 2 story follows the Emerson family as they move to California, where they discover their new town's dark history of missing people and fanged gang activity. You get it. It's the same thing. Now, as a follow-up to something that's beloved, it's always going to get compared to the first one. Unfairly so, because that is already setting a bar that is completely unattainable for most films. But to copy and paste the story is really just fanning the flames. This movie made the bizarre decision to recycle the arc from the first film with a few Mad Libs type changes, like making the biker gang a surfer gang. Retelling the same story but shittier was never going to be the blueprint for success. Apparently the script was originally written as its own standalone movie about werewolves, but that script kept getting turned down by major studios for being too similar to The Lost Boys. So I guess Warner Brothers decided, hey, give us that script, we'll switch werewolves to vampires, throw Corey Feldman in there.
Who ordered the steak?
Call it a day, and then boom, you got a cheap cash grab. The movie's subtitle, The Tribe, was actually the initial title to this would-be movie. As such, it shouldn't surprise you to know that they get nothing right. Absolutely nothing. If those who produced and pieced together this movie actually did see The Lost Boys, which I doubt that they have, then they didn't understand what it was that made that movie so successful. These movies did nothing right. They translated nothing from the original.
Yeah, I can see that.
They don't capture the tone, but more importantly, they don't capture the magic of that first movie. And once again, I know that the bar was set high, but it's like you didn't even try. Even something as simple as the iconic vampire face from the classic, a look that would later go on to be utilized by several other vampire IPs over the years. Even that, they butcher. Not only do the vampires look nothing like they did in the original, but they don't even look like what they looked like at the start of the movie by the end of the movie. Their appearance is altered scene by scene. It is never an upgrade, and it is wildly inconsistent. This vampire movie can't even get vampires right. These sequels latch themselves onto the first one like a parasitic bloodsucker. It seems like their only idea of sequelizing their source is by making awful references to it at any chance that they get.
Not bad at all. Right, little sister?
I have got the Goonies.
I understood that reference.
Yeah, you heard it straight from the man himself, all you lost boys and girls.
He said it! He said it!
Oh, hey, look, it's the tie-in comic. That's a neat little reference. Why is it on screen? That's supposed to have happened. That's supposed to be a real thing. Why is it there? Okay, you know what? That one's actually kind of funny. I don't hate that one. Some of their illusions feel really lame and not fully thought out. The main characters in the tribe are named Chris and Nicole Emerson. It's a little bit of a shout out to the main characters of the first film, Sam and Michael, as they share the same last name. But no real relation between the characters is ever stated, and I don't think that it's supposed to be implied because Sam does show up for a split second at the end, and yeah, no correlation there whatsoever. At some point in time, it almost feels disrespectful for these movies to mention their connections to the first one. The fact that these movies exist is a blight against cinema and creativity. But to constantly remind us what they're trying and failing to emulate really makes me want to just turn this off and play the classic again. On this set, no one working behind the scenes was the same, and very few of the original cast actually bothered to return.
With Joel. We need Joel,
Yeah.
we need, you know.
He was the director of the first one. He'd have to direct the sequel.
But I would do it regardless of anything.
Obviously, none of the original vampires would be coming back, as they've been burned at the stake, so to speak. But you also have no Michael, no Star, no Lucy, no Grandpa, no Nanook, nobody. It seems Corey Feldman's inclusion was the selling point of these films, as if he was the one person symbolic of that original one. But in actuality, he wasn't even one of the main characters. He was one half of a team of supporting characters. And don't get me wrong, he was one of the most memorable characters in the movie, but without his brothers standing by his side, it felt half-assed having only one half of that team present in the tribe. Which is strange because he was included in the actual movie, but all his scenes were left on the cutting room floor. However, he would make his return in the follow-up The Thirst. But we'll get into him in a moment. Corey's Eggers seems stilted. I guess I always assumed that the reason the Frog Brother always spoke the way that he did was because he was desperately attempting to sound like a mature badass. It was a put-on, it was pretend. But all these years later, having the characters speak in the same strange voice felt like a mistake to me. I'm willing to say that that might just be me, maybe that's what I took from it, but I always believed that that was just a child desperately trying to emulate an adult.
We're dedicated to a higher purpose. We're fighters for truth, justice, and the American way.
My problem is you glorify vampirism. You make being a vampire look sexy.
The fact that the character hasn't changed in 20 plus years really makes him feel like a one-note joke in sequels that feel more like spoofs. The Frog Brothers always felt like satires of movie badasses. Kids who were replicating the action heroes they saw on TV, the characters that they read about in comics. But now it feels like it's gone from Scream levels of satire to scary movie levels of parody. Regardless, it's the least of these films' worries. Initially, Feldman wasn't even keen on returning to the role, as the part was written as more of a glorified cameo, looking to capitalize on the two Coreys reality TV show.
It is time to write the sequel to Lost Boys. End of story. I smell Oscar.
His brother Alan Frog fares a little bit better, not feeling nearly as embarrassing as his own on-screen brother, but that may just be because he gets so little screen time to begin with. His inclusion in these films makes it incredibly apparent that there was no bigger plan in place, as his original inclusion in the sequel was to set up for another sequel which would presumably see him return as the big bad. Instead, when that sequel did end up getting made, he plays a bit part in passing in the background, where we're shown that he's indeed been turned into a vampire, or half of one, but he doesn't feed off humans. Jameson Newlander actually did a really great job of recreating his childhood performance. And like Corey as Edgar, it feels like he's mostly the same character. I think why I'm more fond of him in the role rather than Corey Feldman is just because the character feels a little bit more natural and a lot less put on. Once again, that could just be a me thing, but it's my video, so
We'll hang out, we'll get together once a year.
And then we'll talk about why we didn't do the right sequel for Lost Boys.
I love it.
Now, I mentioned before that Sam makes an appearance, but that appearance is at the very end of the second film, and after the credits sting that goes absolutely nowhere. Luckily, Corey Haim returns to the role, but unfortunately, it's not much of a role for him to return to. Now, initially this part was going to be significantly bigger, probably on the same level as the other Coreys, but Haim was plagued by drug issues that were very evidently butting their heads at the time, making filming with him so difficult that he wound up almost being cut from the movie in its entirety. There were also 2 additional alternate endings with him shot, both of which were made to essentially set up the next movie, where he's shown warning his old friend about the return of his brother, both of which scenes would have been a lot better than the one that we ended up with. In the final cut of the film, the actual ending of the movie is Sam showing up and stepping out of the shadows, only to reveal that he's now one of the bloodsuckers that they used to fight against. The 2 collide just as the credits roll, and this scene ultimately ends in Sam's off-screen death, a fact made that much more tragic when you realize that this would be one of Haim's last roles before his untimely death. And considering that Sam shows up as a vampire in 2 out of 3 of these endings, I can only imagine that Alan Frogg's place in the Thirst might have been a part of the plans for Haim's character, should he have returned to the sequel. But that story then had to be switched over to this character once it became clear that that would not be the case. In general, the tribe is a tired retread, a Lost Boys that I wish would have stayed lost. The Thirst, however, is completely its own thing. Unfortunately, it still sucks in a very similar nature. None of the new additions in the later installments stick, with every new character established in the tribe not returning for the Thirst, making this whole trilogy feel incredibly fractured. The new characters are bland and forgettable. They feel like generic silhouettes rather than fully fleshed out 3-dimensional characters. And I could not tell you a name of a single character from the third movie outside of DJX, and I only remember that because it was so stupid sounding. Mind you, I wrote this script when I was watching these movies. That's how inconsequential everything in this is, and how forgettable our leads actually are. None of them make an impression, including, but not limited to, the movie's big bads. One is a surfer who is surface level, despite thinking that he's a deep thinker. He's a guy who's built up but never paid off, because he's taken out with relative ease. And the other of which is a vampire DJ, because the last Lost Boys movie is all about a vampire rave. So now not only does this fail at being a Lost Boys movie, but it also fails at being Blade. The Lost Boys 2 is overly reliant on gore and edgy humor, both of which being cringy in their own right, but more importantly, both which are seriously out of place in a Lost Boys movie. While sexuality is definitely entangled with vampirism in the original, it's not overshadowed by it. In contrast, The Lost Boys 2 can't wait to get characters naked and show you scenes that I can't show you for monetization purposes. And I'm sure that there are people who will complain about me complaining about that, but my issue isn't doing this in a movie. It's doing this in this movie. Sometimes there's a time and place for these things, and this is neither. Everything about the movie is obnoxious. It's loud, but it never has anything to say. The Lost Boys 3 does try to tone it down a bit, but not by much. It's not trying to go back to the franchise's roots, but instead it tries to provide a softer experience of the second flick. There's a lot of thinly veiled Twilight hate, which would resonate with me if it wasn't coming from another movie of which I hate. Because you can't roast a bad vampire movie in your own bad vampire movie. It negates the purpose, it cancels out. And plus, at least Twilight, which I never thought in my life would be a sentence I ever had to say, but at least Twilight was consistent. It was always terrible. It was just as bad at the end as it was in the beginning. It didn't go downhill, it stayed awful all throughout. It's not like the first installment of that series was historic, while the next ones were historically horrendous. As you could probably imagine, the day the Lost Boys died was when they didn't leave well enough alone. The day they decided to sequelize a sequence of events that didn't need a sequel. The day that they tampered with perfection. I still have a lot more I'd like to say about these movies, but I think those thoughts are better saved for videos on each installment individually. You've heard me talk about why the sequels are bad, but I'd really love to talk to you about why the original is so great. So if you like this video and would maybe be interested in seeing a video on the first Lost Boys, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
"We are Lost Boys." I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.